Welcome everyone to our special program this evening featuring the co-author of the book, Justice Deferred, Race and the Supreme Court. This book is available to borrow from the Livermore Public Library. I am sharing on the chat a link to a handout that are showing some interesting facts that you will find in the book Justice Deferred. So click the link in the chat to view the handout, and I appreciate our guests for providing that handout to us. And I invite community members to submit their questions in the chat box, which I will be monitoring. I'm delighted to introduce my co-host, the moderator for this discussion, and the person who, without him, this program would not be possible. I'm talking about Tony Baylis, who is a senior leader, partner, and international advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. He collaborates with Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories senior leadership on the organization's DEI strategy, and he leads the execution of building a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive lab culture and workforce. Tony's career spans over 30 years of administrative, project, program, technical, organizational, management, and senior leadership in industry, academia, government, film and broadcast media, scientific and technical environments. He represents Lawrence Livermore National Lab on the subjects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, science, engineering, arts and mathematics, outreach, and K-12 student programs. Hello, Tony. He's coming from us from Fiji, people, from Fiji. So if he's a little choppy, you can tell he's thousands of miles away, and he's coming to us through the magic of Zoom.
Well, thanks, Paul. Yes, I am coming to you all from Fiji. And thank you for that really kind introduction. I very appreciate it. Yeah, my hope is that my internet holds while I'm here, and that everything is going to be okay for this wonderful conversation that you all will be listening to. And it is our hope, the Livermore Library, Paul and myself, that this particular author and very distinguished, basically educator, that will be able to provide you with some historical context around a lot of subjects that we're going to try to explore in this next hour. So with that, I'll move forward with introducing my distinguished colleague and wonderful, wonderful dear friend, Dr. Orville Vernon Burton, who is the Judge Matthew J. Perry Distinguished Professor of History, Sociology, and Anthropology. Can't talk right now. Anthropology, Pan-African Studies and Computer Science at Clemson University, and Emeritus University Distinguished Teacher, Scholar, University Scholar, and Professor of History, African American Studies, Sociology at the University of Illinois as well, where Vernon and I met as we both work in the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the university. Vernon has written nearly 300 articles and written over or edited more than 200 books, including The Age of Lincoln in 2007, which won the Chicago Tribune Heartland Literary Award for nonfiction. In My Father's House are many mansions, family and community in Edgefield, South Carolina. He had written in 1985, and Penn Center, A History Preserved in 2014. And currently, he has written a book, co-authored with a civil rights attorney, Armand Derfner, Justice Deferred, Race in the Supreme Court. Vernon is a graduate of Furman College in Princeton. And with that, Vernon, I'd like to welcome you and have you let the audience know anything else about you, my friend, because if I'm not mistaken, you were also a military veteran. Is that correct?
That I am, but one of the things I'm proudest of is to be Tony Baylis's friend, and that's why I'm here. And we're doing this via the internet, and I was just thinking, Tony, where we were at University of Illinois, NCSA is where, you know, Mosaic was developed, became Netscape, that turned the internet into sort of a click and point playground that has allowed us to do this sort of amazing thing with you in Fiji. Here I am in Clemson in South Carolina, and Paul is in San Diego, and knows where our audience is. So it's pretty wonderful. I grew up
Livermore.
Yeah, he's in Livermore, California.
I wish San Diego would be nice too. I wish.
Well, both are nice. Both are nice. And I grew up in the small rural town. I grew up in the country. 96 is the name of the town, 96, South Carolina. Those interested in race relations might know that the great Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, the longtime president of Morehouse College, considered one of the greatest, well, one of the three greatest theologians of the 20th century. And most people know him because of his relationship with Martin Luther King Jr., who he took in as a student at the age of 15 during World War II at Morehouse College with an incredibly gifted group of students, including the great historian Lerone Bennett, the longtime journalist of Ebony, and often called the spiritual godfather of the civil rights movement. And one of the most interesting things is I met him at Furman my senior year in religious emphasis week. Had no idea he was from my hometown. I truly believe that he's probably the greatest South Carolinian, the greatest person to come out of South Carolina as a leader and important figure. And yet it was because I grew up in the age of segregation that I did not know who this extraordinary man was, who came back regularly to visit his family and things. It's one of the tragedies of Reconstruction. And it wasn't that the town fathers and town mothers were deliberately shunning or not recognizing him, but that again was one of the tragedies of segregation, of not knowing about it. Now, I'm not saying we have integration today. I think that's a mistake to say that we have integration. We have certain areas, but segregation was a very different kind of thing. And I like to say that I grew up separated from my best friend in a segregated society only by an unsegregated cow pasture. I had a friend, Willis, who was a little bit older than me, who was African-American family. We spent the night with each other. We played, we did everything together. It influenced me, that in my mother's faith, but also because I grew up with segregation, the civil rights movement, of course, the Vietnam War. Those were an interesting time to grow up as a historian, sort of are the things that made me try to figure out my society and what was going on and why I study what I do.
Well, hey, that is what I was going to ask you. Why you studied what the area of history and social science, and really trying to figure out, you know, because I've known you for a while, and what the audience doesn't know is that what you're listening to is a really renowned historian who has won many accolades and awards from various organizations, Rockefeller Center, Pew Research, and the one I think, Vernon, you're probably most proud of is probably the ones that related to you teaching your students. Those students have recognized you over and over again for your presence in that classroom and how you've taught them. And I would wonder, that is really what is at your heart, is to share with the audiences that you come into contact with, especially the students. Is that an accurate sort of interpretation?
No, I think it's true. And the same thing about the writing. I certainly came out of a background, as I said, this was a cotton mill town, though I lived in the country, but neither my father nor mother had ever got the opportunity to finish high school. So education was a far thing for me. So the writing is an extension of that. And I try to emphasize to people that the real emphasis on learning, we say is teaching, but it's about students or people learning. So I try to see myself as an enabler of people to learn, to help people learn. And we all learn in different ways at different speeds, at different processes and times. And so I try to take that into account. But I believe sincerely, and I don't want to sound like an alarmist, but I think that we're in a real crisis. I know you care about education, Tony.
Yep.
And I think we're not only in a crisis in education, but we're in a crisis for democracy right now. And I think part of the problem is, in fact, that education and democracy are linked, and that democracy is a fragile thing. We haven't had it that long, and we've come close to losing it in 1860 to 65, and we're back in a struggle for democracy yet again. And I believe the only way that we can deal with this is, in fact, through education, through learning. I've often said two things changed the American South: air conditioning and the Voting Rights Act. And yet we know much better how air conditioning works because we care so much about STEM, about science and mathematics. And I do too, as you know, having worked at NCIT, know they're important. But so is our history. And so is what we used to call civics and the understanding of how our government works. And I fear that we are paying the consequences by not having paid attention to these things as we should.
Wow. Yeah, I would agree with that. And hopefully that's what we're going to try to give this audience, some experience with learning from your knowledge, your experience, your life journey, and the things that you studied also well. And, you know, you're talking about segregation and integration and things of that nature. You know, it leads me to our first question, centered around a couple of days ago, we just acknowledged Juneteenth again, right? So would you mind giving our audience a little bit of historical context and understanding around Juneteenth? Because you did that so well when you talked to us a couple of years ago at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and we still have people talking about you and that wonderful talk that you gave us. So can you give this audience some information?
And I'll try not to take up the whole hour and a half. And things have really happened. When we last talked, I think it was not long after the George Floyd incident, which inspired, I think, a lot of people to look back at Juneteenth and what was going on. And as I remember at that time, you know, almost right when I was talking to New York and Virginia made it a state holiday, and now it's made under President Biden, it is recognized as a national holiday. And that's pretty exciting because there's a story behind this. It was just 2 weeks after President Lincoln announced on September the 2nd, 1862, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And in this preliminary proclamation, Lincoln actually gave the former Confederacy 4 months to come back in the Union, or he would end slavery. And of course, this is a presidential proclamation, which will lead us to something we'll talk about hopefully later, the 13th Amendment and why it was necessary at the time. But at that very time, the Union forces abandoned Galveston, Texas. Now, for the 250,000 enslaved people in Texas, the loss of the Union toehold was a disaster for their hopes of freedom, because instead there was no refuge for them to flee to go to. And what you saw in the history of the Civil War is whenever the Union Army came close, then African Americans would flee to the Army, many to fight, bring their families, escape to freedom. It made a lie, in fact, of the idea that white Southerners had tried to tell the North for a long time, that African Americans were satisfied. Instead, as the minute the Union Army was within region, there would just be wholesale desertions to go with the Union Army. So Texas really had to wait for events outside to deliver emancipations. Well, the federal forces finally landed in Galveston and reestablished a constitutional authority in Texas on June 18, 1865. Now that's 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. And that had declared enslaved people forever free in rebel-controlled Texas. And of course, it's even after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865. And a lot of people don't realize, they think of the Emancipation as this dry legal document. And it may have been, but there's some interesting things there. It actually gave not only the right for African Americans to fight in the Union armies, which Lincoln said made the difference in winning the war, that is Black soldiers, the 250,000 more so of them that did it, but it also gave African Americans the right to have an insurrection, to fight, and immediately it made a difference in the war. So the next day, on June 19th, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger stepped out on the balcony of the Ashton Villa, a home that had previously served as actually the headquarters for the rebel army in that region. And he read what's called General Order Number 3. And I quote, this is, I'm gonna read it so I don't know it by heart. But this is how we get Juneteenth. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. And the connection herefore to existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Well, ever since that declaration, June 19th has been celebrated as Emancipation Day in Texas, with a unique and distinct moniker called Juneteenth, because of the date, of course. Typical celebrations of Texas Emancipation Day included readings of the Emancipation Proclamation, barbecue, dancing, singing, and poetry, recitations as the day grew into a wider celebration of African American culture in Texas. The great migrations of the 20th century of Black Texans to the Midwest and California helped spread the holiday to new regions of the country. After a century of observance by the state's African American population and a renewed push for civil rights in the 1950s and 1960s, the Texas legislature officially made Juneteenth a state holiday in 1980. Today, the holiday remains one of the many reminders of the complex history of emancipation and freedom in the United States. Now, I want to relate that to the book I've just done, because one of the things that these history lessons enforced are that there are laws, and it's true today as it was in 1863, that laws do matter, but it matters more how they are interpreted is essential to freedom, especially for minorities. And that's what the Supreme Court has been doing, interpreting these laws. We can go on to talk about the 13th Amendment, which is one of the themes in the book, but it was necessary because Lincoln realized it was a proclamation. It was a wartime measure. And there were even rumors that Roger Taney, the famous Chief Justice who had ruled in 1858, that African Americans, even free African Americans, let alone slaves, had no rights as people in the United States. It was an example of bad history. I just wrote an op-ed, I hope will be published, showing that it's bad history, just as Alito's leaked draft is another bad history example of using history. He was just wrong when he says African Americans had never had rights. They voted. They voted at the time of Constitution. Even in the slave state of North Carolina, free African Americans had the same rights as free white people and voted and made a difference until after Nat Turner's rebellion in the 1830s. So those laws really matter. And that is why Lincoln pushed so much for the 13th Amendment, knowing that Roger Taney, many people said had already written out a Supreme Court opinion saying that the Emancipation Proclamation was not legal. That would have meant slavery again. So when you see the movie, if you've not seen it, the Spielberg movie, Lincoln, it's historically pretty bad, but it gets the essence of Lincoln, the politician, making that 13th Amendment happen. And it was the first time ever, and Congress got a little upset. He actually signed the 13th Amendment because it meant so much to him that he had come to believe in the freedom of African Americans, particularly arguing that they had fought so hard and made a difference to win the war for the Unionists. Since they fought, they had the rights to become citizens. So we can go on about Juneteenth. I can talk the whole time. That's a little background and history to it, and how really it's sort of sad, but it was the George Floyd incident that brought attention to it again. And it was there, and now it's been recognized by the current president of the United States and signed into a law.
Well, and it's recognized in a lot of parts of the United States, including Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where our Black Employees Resource Group is basically observing it with staff, and they're putting together, they put together a nice barbecue and things of that nature, music, all of that. And they're really sold out.
Texas all those years. That's
exactly. So
it's also a good example of how culture spreads, Tony. You think about it, all these Texans who went out to other places and over time, and it really became in different areas.
Well, it also speaks to what you were talking about learning and education. I have to admit, I was ignorant growing up in the inner city of Chicago. Did not know Juneteenth, not till I came to the laboratory. I didn't even know it when I was at the University of Illinois. So
and now it's celebrated Illinois, but it was not when we were there.
No, it wasn't.
No.
So that was the thing. But with that said, I think this is part of the learning sort of journey that we're all on and still learning. And I wonder, did some of this come out for you in regard to the 13th Amendment and Lincoln, and you writing your book about the age of Lincoln and how you went about really researching it and how it also elevated your learning around a lot of the things that are talked about today with race, and also going back to that time with Lincoln, because he helped us move on into this journey, right?
He extraordinarily did. I mean, it's amazing. And I mentioned Dr. Mays, who is a personal hero of mine. I got to be a friend of his. He asked me to he actually asked me to edit his great book, Born to Rebel, which is autobiography. But I'm such a slow writer, unfortunately. He died before I finished, and the family didn't want it changed. So I wrote a long foreword to it to bring it back out into print so it could be available, and it's still available. And I recommend that book. I tell people usually that when they buy my books that they can take them as tax deduction, because all proceeds go to gifted children. And I'm willing to go anywhere and argue with the IRS that my grandchildren are the most gifted children in the world. So you should, except this book and the Penn Center book, all the proceeds from Born to Rebel actually go to Morehouse College. I made that donation for Dr. Mays, and then the book I did on Penn Center was to help Penn Center, which is an amazing place. We could spend another 5 hours talking about, which
yes, we could.
During the Civil War. In fact, in 1862, an amazing place when whites ran away from the Union Army that came there, and it formed one of the very first African-American schools, and it still exists today. And it was a place where Martin Luther King had his citizenship schools, and he retreated. And it's where he even planned Tony the March on Washington was at Penn Center. And one of the reasons was it was isolated because segregation was the law and whites and blacks couldn't be together in South Carolina, but it's 2 islands over from Beaufort and people didn't know what was going on there. And it's still going as a community center and research now. And President Obama made it part of the first Reconstruction National Park Service. So it's an exciting place for people to visit if they want to. But about Lincoln, I try to tell people about, there was a session on my book, The Age of Lincoln, at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which is the major association that goes back over time to Carter G. Woodson for the study of African American history. It was pretty well ignored by most white scholars. W. Du Bois and others were writing, but they were being ignored. And so he formed this association and what had been the Journal of Negro History, now the Journal of African American History. And there was a session. I was very pleased with it, but everyone was African American except for me on the panel. And it divided very evenly. Every person younger than I was really disliked Lincoln, who were African American, these scholars, and those my age and others. There was a divide. So, I taught Southern history at the University of Illinois for 34 years, and I wrote this book on Lincoln. It enabled me to retire early, come back south. I actually moved back home to 96 South Carolina and discovered that, in fact, things had changed since I left. People in South Carolina did not like Lincoln. It was not like that when I was a boy. The culture wars have been hard, but it wasn't just whites. The libertarian movement had a huge effect on this because he brings in big government and changing things with the war. But also African Americans who I'd grown up with, like my friend who I called brother and still call brother, Willis Wood. There was a picture of Lincoln in many African American homes. And now he'd gone from the great emancipator to the great white honky among African Americans. So I was really surprised, and I've studied this. But what I have discovered, and part of it goes back to the work on white liberals, basically, and where they were. But what I've discovered is that Lincoln was not born the great emancipator. He grew. And that is something about, we were talking about education, is so important. He learned from the great Robert Small, from Frederick Douglass, from Harriet Turner, from Sojourner Truth. And when African Americans fought for the Union, when he thought he was going to lose a Civil War, he calls Harriet Tubman, said, we got to get as many people out as we can because I'm not going to be reelected. And the Confederacy will come back in. By the end of the war, he's actually leading the nation to a better place on race relations. And he is killed, not in fact because of the Emancipation Proclamation, as a lot of people thought, but Charles Wilkes Booth actually said, when Lincoln is making a speech, and you want to know what Lincoln was really thinking, get him when he's doing one of these impromptu speeches instead of trying to write it out carefully and read it. And he stands up at his window and he talks about Black citizenship. And Booth turns to his colleague and he says, he's talking about, use the N-word citizen. That'll be the last speech he ever makes. And it was when Booth killed him. So he was killed for advocating Black voting rights, limited as it was at that time, and has to be understood in that context. And in fact, the Emancipation, do you want me to talk a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah, see, I think you should, because
Okay.
it's connected. It's connected.
It really is. And the way it's connected is this. My friend Lerone Bennett, who I got to be close with when we were both in Illinois, the long-term editor of Ebony, we were both great fans of Benjamin E. Mays. He wrote an article called The Last of the Great School Teachers, talking about Dr. Mays. And he wrote the book Forced into Glory, which is one of the reasons so many people don't like Lincoln, saying that Lincoln was forced to do the Emancipation Proclamation. And that goes because of his letter he wrote to Horace Greeley. And Greeley had published a letter saying, and calling on Lincoln, it was called The Prayer of 20 Million. And that 20 million was actually the population of the free states of the United States during the Civil War. The prayer was that wanted Lincoln to end slavery. So he called on Lincoln to end slavery. Lincoln, in fact, responded back, and these are the words that's always quoted. You know, if I could save this union by freeing no slaves, I would. If I could save the union by freeing all, I would. If I could save the union by freeing some and not others, I would. So that is the context. Now, what everybody does is ignore the other part of the letter, which says, I've always hated slavery. If it was up to just me, I would end slavery. But as president, I don't know how I can do it under this. It's about saving the Union. Well, the most interesting thing is he'd already written the Emancipation Proclamation. He had already done it. So why didn't he just say to Horace Greeley when he writes back, where he wrote this actually response to a conservative paper to make sure that people saw it? Why didn't he just say to Horace, you're right, Horace, and I've got right here an Emancipation Proclamation. I've already shown it to my cabinet. They convinced me to hold back till it doesn't look like we're losing the war, and it's a desperate measure, but you're absolutely right. And the reason is he was a master politician. You know, I actually think that as good a politician as Bill Clinton and Obama were and Ronald Reagan, I think that he could have drank their milkshakes, to put it in terms of another Spielberg movie. He was so good as a politician. He was, in fact, moving the country to where he wanted them to be, bringing them along, preparing them for this Emancipation Proclamation. And that's what he's doing at the end of his life, preparing them again for writing these letters privately to the governor of Louisiana and other places. And people also ask me, well, why did Lincoln not define the war about ending slavery if he personally hated slavery, as he said he did? And this is where we are in a similar situation, I think, today, Tony, very similar. Okay. Lincoln knew his history much better than we today in politicians. He read the newspapers from Germany and France and everywhere else. And we think sort of, we know how the Civil War turned out, and the Union won and Lincoln won. But as I said, people now know that they almost lost, even at the last, that the Confederacy almost won. What they don't understand, and what Lincoln did understand, is that the Confederacy was in fact much more in line with the rest of the world, and the United States was unique. We know there was the American Revolution, which inspired the French Revolution, and then all over the world, democracies and republics sprung up. People believed, and of course it was, you know, it's sexist sounding, but they believed that men should be able to govern themselves, that society had been structured so you had a king who God gave him the right to rule, and then the aristocrats and the others and the dukes. And if your father had been a farmer, you had to be a farmer. If your father had been a cobbler, that was what you would do. There was no opportunity really for social movement. But this revolution, the American Revolution, changed everything. The French Revolution, all. But by the 1860s, if you look at, for instance, one of my very favorite musicals, Les Miserables, it's about the 1830 failure of France and the revolution, because Napoleon took back over, and Napoleon III is on the throne. It's back to a monarchy. He then puts, in fact, Maximilian on the throne in Mexico, which had been a republican at a month. The great Garibaldi, the hero of two continents, liberating in Latin America countries. He goes back to Italy. He reunites Italy, and he thinks it's going to be a democracy, become a republic. And what does it become? A monarchy. So the Confederacy, with its hierarchy, with his argument for slavery and the people on, is much more in rule. So when in line with the rest of the world, in the United States, when Lincoln says it's the last best hope, he means it, because he knows that he was born in a log cabin with a dirt floor, and he worked hard, and he rose up in society. I used to like to tell people there's so many myths about Lincoln that it's not true that he built that log cabin with his own hands and he was born in, but that he really was born poor, and his father didn't really believe in education for farmers. He only had a year's, but he worked so hard. And this is part of his belief that affects him in terms of African American. Even in the worst things he ever said, he always believed that any individual, whether they were black or white, and one of the reasons he hated slavery so much was, if you worked hard, you should go as far as your abilities took you, and you should be rewarded accordingly. So that's all tied into why preserve the Union mattered. And the big issue to me is what would have happened if he had defined this war about ending slavery instead of preserving the Union. It later becomes both with the Emancipation Proclamation, a war to save the Union and to end slavery. And they are tied together very closely. As he says, it's only because of black soldiers who are willing to fight for the Union that the Union won. And Lincoln proclaims that to people several times. But it is tied so closely together that I think we have to understand that Lincoln, if he had defined this war about ending slavery, we don't know how many white Southerners would have actually fought who didn't own enslaved people for the Confederacy, because it wasn't defined about that. It was defined about nationalism and saving the Union. What I am certain is, if he'd have said this war is to end slavery, he couldn't have got a corporal guard of Yankees to have gone down to fight that war. It was only when the Confederacy fired on Fort Sumter. And it's hard for us to imagine today, but it's like 9/11, how people felt at 9/11. The country had been attacked. And it's over time that war moves, in fact, to a war to end slavery. And then Lincoln begins to define it as a war to bring about citizenship, which finally happens, in fact, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the latter two really done after his death. And even the 13th Amendment was finally ratified only after his death. Well, I can go on that, but I know you don't want to just me talk about Lincoln forever, but you can see why I like him. And also that Lincoln had his extraordinary faults and disabilities that I'm not trying to say that he didn't, but what is amazing to me is how he worked with those disabilities and those handicaps that I think led to his greatness, his compassion for other people. You know, he was subject to depression, all sorts of issues. And I think that's why so many Americans do identify with. So I was very happy to see that Obama became a Lincoln fan. And I hope and I think that has affected people, particularly African-Americans' view of Lincoln since. I'd like to say I was invited by Lincoln's sister to Hawaii to give 3 or 4 lectures. And so she bought a copy of my book to give her brother for his birthday. And I always thought that he became a better president after he read my interpretation of Lincoln than his initial. But you might remember he styled his campaign by announcing at the Springfield State House, just like Lincoln did.
That's, yep,
And
yep.
bought into that idea. Well, I've taken you too far astray, but it
Oh,
is relevant to where we're going with race and the Supreme Court.
Yeah,
And
but
I will
that's
say
part
this,
of this.
like Lincoln appointed as a replacement for, and this tells you a lot about Lincoln and his belief. He appointed to replace Tony, the Chief Justice Supreme Court, when he died. Boy, I'm blanking here. This is bad when you get old, Tony, and having a senior moment.
You're okay.
Yeah. Why am I blanking on is it Chase? Yes, Chase as Supreme Court Justice, because his commitment to freedom for African Americans, leading abolitionists, and he appointed him. And as he said, he was a thorn in Lincoln's side. They did not get along at all. He said, I'd rather have swallowed my buckhorn chair. And if you ever saw a buckhorn chair, you can imagine what that takes to swallow, than appoint Chase. But he knew that he was solid on standing for Black rights. And that is why he appointed Chase as the judge to replace Judge Tony. And there was a period of time where all of these wonderful things were happening at Reconstruction about freedom and equality were being accepted by the Supreme Court too, until things changed with the end of Reconstruction.
Like I said, you are full of knowledge for all of us to learn from on facts related to history. And there's even a question already around the Supreme Court and what it is today. And person asked about what you think about, the current court and also the current dialogue going on, especially what you had alluded to earlier about Alito leaking out. But before we go there, I promised that
Tony,
person too.
Yeah, and I can send you an op-ed, or I can send it to Paul that I wrote on this, his bad use of history, which has nothing to do with abortion, but his bad use of history to make that argument if people would like to see it.
Yeah, so that would be good. I think that would be good for the audience that basically may be interested in learning a little bit more around that. But before we go there, let's talk about Justice Deferred a little bit here. I think we got about 20 minutes or less. And race in the Supreme Court. A couple different questions. One, why did you write it? And then two, what would you like the readers to take away from the book?
Well, there's so much I want to take away in some major thesis, but how I came to write it was, as we were talking a little bit before everyone came on, in 1980, and I hate to say it, it sounds like Yogi Berra, but it's deja vu all over again for me. And this gets to where the court is now. In 1980, after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been so powerful and was changing the South and doing things, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called Mobile versus Bolden, or Bolden versus Mobile. And this was a voting right case, but it doesn't matter. There's a chapter in our book that's called The War of Words Between Effect and Purpose, or Intent, as it's often called. So the Supreme Court saw a case had been decided that the way that the electoral system was set up at large, and with the gerrymandering, and with whites only voting for white people and not even voting for the white candidates that Black people, citizens, were voting for, they could never be elected. And so initially the court had said, well, that's wrong under the voter. And then the Supreme Court said, no, you have to show not the effect. Just because laws discriminate, you have to show that the intent of the law, that the purpose of the law was to discriminate. So I remember that an Alabama paper in the New York Times, some wit said, well, what are we going to do? We're going to dig up these stakeholders, the council people, the legislators who wrote these laws, and ask them, did you intend to discriminate? Was it your purpose to keep Black people from being elected when you wrote these laws? And so attorneys knew that what historians did was to study motivation and effect. So in 1980, I was asked to become involved in a case which had gone on already for 8 years, and finally the judge decided in favor of the Black plaintiffs. And then Mobile versus Bolden comes down and he says, nope, I can't do it. And therefore it has to go on. We're going back to trial. And so that's how I got involved in 1980. And that's where I met Armand Derfner, along with some of the greatest civil rights lawyers. I would say Armand was one of the three greatest. Lachlan McDonald, who headed the ACLU Southern Project, was another. We all worked on that case. So we started talking about these issues of race and the Supreme Court in 1980. And we've never stopped. And I like to say it's a little bit like Casablanca. It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So we have talked about these issues that we're writing about in this book since 1980, working on these issues, and think it's so important for people to understand. And let me tell you why, Tony. We know that there's no such thing as race. Doesn't mean there isn't racism. There's no such thing. Now, you can do it by looking at geneticists. You can do it with, the tracing the genomes and all of these things. Scientists would say there's no such thing. Or you can be like me. That is a person of faith, and I believe that God made us all in her or his image. And so there's no difference. That's what my mother taught me. And yet, in America, starting with laws about 1680 or so, the courts, the legal system, then upheld by the Supreme Court, defined a group of people as a race. And that became the basis for discrimination. That became the base for laws that treated people differently by what they called race. So there's no such thing. It's a social construct. So I think that's important to see how the Supreme Court played a role in this. And what this book really is a study of race relations in what becomes the United States, starting before, when people of African descent, or actually Native Americans, because it deals with all sorts of groups of people, including Latinx, Asians, and others that have been defined as different. But when particularly the laws that we think of as race laws, are started to introduce across all these centuries, changing over time until today. In fact, the book deals with, we even predicted, which is something a historian should never do, the case that Judge Alito really went after the Voting Rights Act, what was left of it, as a tool to enforce fair and equal rights for voting, that just came down in 1981, the Arizona law on redistricting and things. So that that is one takeaway. And one of the things, my generation, we grew up with the Warren Court. So we thought of the court as always, at least I did, doing the right thing, moving us closer to justice, to enabling what I like to say that Lincoln, with the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, changed the Constitution. And that what he did is he took what was our mission statement, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and he put it into our rule book, the Constitution. That the Constitution itself changed with the 13th and 14th, 15th Amendment. Before that, all the amendments had left all the rights to the states. That changed how the Constitution has to be read with the 13th and 14th and 15th. It gives Congress the power to enforce the 13th, the 14th and 15th and any other amendments. And so when justices today read the First and Second Amendment as broad as it can be, that you have the right to carry guns, even though the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia, read as broad as can. They need to read the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, which guarantees not only freedom, but the 13th Amendment, as the early Supreme Court ruled, and then later in the 1980s and 89 again, that the 13th Amendment also ends the badges of slavery. If you want to understand what those badges of slavery are, go to a McDonald's and see who's at the counter doing the money and welcome you, and see who's flipping the burgers. And you'll see minorities back flipping the burgers. That's a badge of slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed that people are treated the same. You have all the treatment has to be the same. And the 15th guarantees the right of a vote, which is we're right back at it now. That's what I wanted to say when I said earlier and didn't finish my train of thought about Lincoln was facing the rise of authoritarianism again, when he said America's the last best hope. And we're facing that same issue both at home and abroad. Once again, the rise of authoritarian governments. And I believe that ours again is the last best hope, just as Lincoln strove. I hope we do not have a civil war, but I think we as citizens must stand up for the rights of equal justice under the law, the rule of law. We lost it with the end of Reconstruction. People ignored it, and good people just did nothing. Most people were not terrorists. Most people were not part of the coup d'etat. Most people were not riding around in robes like Klansmen or night riders to kill and terrorize people. But the tragedy was most good people did nothing. And I think that's where we are now, facing very similar issues in a crisis in democracy, just like we were in 1860. Very similar. Scary how similar it is to me. I'm not saying there are lessons, direct lessons, or history repeats itself, but history, you have to understand how you got to where you are, and then you can make a better informed decision of where you want to go with history. So you have this brief period of the Supreme Court, and then the last, starting about midway through the Burger Court, really picking up with the Rehnquist, and now the Roberts Court, once again has gone back to how it had been really before the war. And what you have, when you look at American history, we counted 25 years as a generation. You have had 12 years where, in fact, the law, not just the way people were, but the law taught not only white privilege, but white supremacy. And that was encoded in the law. And we've only had really 2 generations that we've tried to deal with this and move away from it. So when people get depressed, I try to remind them, we've only had 2 generations where we've actually tried to move away from this older interpretation of the law that said that it's okay to keep one group of people down or treat them different.
Fascinating. Absolutely remarkable how you're able to tie all of this together. And it's hard not to say history is repeating itself. I know you didn't want to go there, but we often
there's
say
such
that.
similarities right now. And this is the first time I've really seen this kind of, so I can give you an example. Do you want one of a fairly modern time?
Yeah,
okay.
we do. All right. We have about 7 minutes left, I think.
Okay, well, this would not be a good thing to end on. I do want to read one section of the book, but
please.
I was called in by both the NACP and LULAC both wanted me to be their expert witness in Texas when Congressman DeLay realized he could do a second redistricting had already been done in Texas and get 2 more congressional districts, which he was determined to make Republican, even though the increase in the population of Texas had in fact been from the Latinx and the African-American population. And so I was called in to be, I said I would do it if the 2 groups, the Latinx, the LULAC, and it would work together so that they could present their arguments together, not divide and be conquered. And it was interesting because the judge, it was the first time in my life I'd ever heard a judge identify himself with a political party, 2003 or 4. And he said to me, you know, Professor Burton, I'm a Republican. Now, before this, I should tell you, the Justice Department lawyer said, Vernon, this judge hates expert witnesses. He had the one before me almost in tears. He says he just thinks that says, so don't worry, we'll try to get you off the stand as quickly as we can, and don't take it personal. Well, instead, he took a liking to me. Invited my wife and me and our 5 kids to come ride the horses on his ranch. He's one of the nicest judges I've ever met. And he said some flattering things. He said something about, you know, he had a question me after I finished. He says, you know, I really enjoyed this, learned about it. He said, but I'm very worried, Professor Burton, you know, young people don't vote. How can we have a democracy if people don't vote? How are we going to get young people to vote? So I was called back in right after Shelby County in 2013, which gutted the Voting Rights Act and took away Section 5. Well, didn't take it away, but the coverage formula, which had kept before that, states which had had the worst records always had to send in when they changed any plans for voting to the Justice Department to have it reviewed to say it was okay. And once that was gone, it was just terrible. I mean, you can see what has happened since. So I was in testifying. It gave me the chance to say, well, you know, this is very interesting to me. The last time I sat in a courtroom in Texas, the judge asked me, how can we get people to vote? And now I am here testifying, and I don't understand, but the state of Texas with their in-person voter ID law is trying to stop people from voting. So what happened? So that led the guy to ask me what happened. Then I was able to tell him, and I think this is part of what it was, literally. Anytime you have a recession and bad economic times, there's strains, and you can see historically race relations. People feel like the pie is not big enough and I'm going to protect mine. That's part of it. But the bigger part was Barack Obama, an African-American, ran for office. For the first time ever, minorities registered at a rate as high and sometimes higher than whites. And they also voted at a higher rate because they had someone they could identify with who they thought would represent their interests, and they came out. Not only that, he won. And that not only shook people, but it was more than that. In that decade, Texas realized that it was becoming a majority minority state. The rest of the United States has discovered that as well. So that, I think, has set off this reaction. And politicians, you know, and I take my faith seriously, and I hope I go to heaven, but there's not going to be a heaven for me if some of these politicians who have used race as a way to motivate people to vote against their own economic and social interests to get political power aren't in hell burning. I'll tell you, it is just, to me, one of the worst things. And I think that's part of what has set us off. And the Supreme Court has become so partisan. It is very similar to the way the court used to rule. So it's rather frightening. So that's a long story about my own experience, but I think there is a larger truth there about what's going on in America at this time. Judges have always supposed to rule by the law. And it's not supposed to be partisan in politics.
That's right.
but something is really happening. And despite Judge Roberts trying to balance it, I'm very, very worried. And there's a major difference. During Jim Crow years, during the segregation years, when the court was ruling unfavorably toward minorities and to support segregation, they were probably in line with most people in the United States, that most people believed in white supremacy, that most people believed in segregation. I mean, I don't want to say people are racist, doesn't matter, you don't have to. But today, the Supreme Court is very much not in line with American society. You can see that in the last election. You can see that who got, even when in 2016, Hillary Clinton got more votes. The Electoral College elected Donald Trump, but the person who got the majority of the vote. The Supreme Court today, I would argue, is out of step with where Americans are. And just look at young people. Look at young people. They don't want to be discriminated. There are more of us than there are of them, and that's what's frightening people. Just look how quickly young people accepted something I never thought would happen in my lifetime, same-sex marriage, and support it. And you know, it's on TV, and people are accepting it, particularly young people. They do not believe in discriminating against other people. And therefore, the court has gotten way away from where I think the majority of the people, what they think and what they believe in terms of equal justice under the law and ruling by the law and not discriminating against people and allowing people to vote.
Oh boy, and that is a lot to take in. And so Paul, I think we about wrapped up our time, if I'm not mistaken. And Vernon, going back to the young people and such, you know, it's like, I find it so fascinating in the sense that we say we're surprised of what the young people, how we brought them up. We're the ones who raised them. So guess what? Why are we so surprised? That means you brought them up with that sort of, whether it's conscious or unconscious, frame of thought around that we're all for humanity, not just for a race here and there. It's all about humanity.
Tony, part of it is about history. It takes a long time.
Yeah.
I really believe that the high school, public school teachers are doing God's work. And, you know, I knew the true story of our history when I was at graduate school at Princeton in 1970, but it's taken a while. And they have been teaching this true story about slavery, you know, and about the Civil War was about enslaved people to end that. And finally, that's gotten down to this generation of students have learned the truth. And that's why people are trying to pass laws to stop the truth now. It's because the truth has made it. I love the quote. It's by Henry Adams, the Education of Henry Adams. And he says that the American mind is unique because it doesn't know its history and it's ignorant of its history. And I think that has been a problem, and we've been addressing that. But I loved what his grandfather, the second president, John Adams, said. He said, facts are stubborn things, but they are there and you can't get around them. So if we are teaching the truth, it can make it, and I really do believe the truth can set us free. But if we cannot, with this reactions in Tennessee, my own state of South Carolina, saying you cannot teach things that make people feel uncomfortable, you cannot talk about race, I'm not sure what's going to happen. But they understand the power of the truth, so they're trying to stop it. And that's what I've always done in these courtrooms since 1980, is try to speak truth to power. And I have seen judges who made the correct rulings because when they understood the truth, they wanted to follow those laws. And I'll tell one, there's so much, I didn't really get to it, but I came up with a new hero, Charles Evan Hughes. Charles Evan Hughes, of course, I went to Princeton, and Woodrow Wilson was like a god there because he'd been president of the university. All us historians liked the president who had been there. And yet when the person who ran against him was Charles Evan Hughes, and I thought it was a big corporate lawyer, but he's the one that starts changing how the court rules. Before you wouldn't have had a Warren court, I don't think, if you hadn't had Chief Justice Hughes or there. Always South Carolina, Arkansas, Oklahoma, they would say, oh, these laws don't discriminate. They say nothing about we are stopping Black people from voting. It just says we have a poll tax. That could be white or Black. It just says you have an understanding clause. Well, a white, but there were all these laws that were written to keep Black people from voting, or in the case, not just voting, of going to jail. The first one, in fact, was African Americans who were being really were going to be hanged for because of a riot that occurred that actually whites were the rioters. Chief Justice Hughes says, well, you know what? I'd like to see the evidence. No one ever had. So he looked at the evidence and they started ruling against these states and those laws. And one of the things I loved when I started studying this corporate lawyer, his father was an immigrant who was an American Baptist minister. It's American Baptist who supported, in fact, Morehouse College had been good, were great on race, and so was he. In fact, when he's Chief Justice, I have a little thing here, I can read it, but I won't. They just had the new courthouse, and over the top of the courthouse, it says equal justice under the law. Woodrow Wilson, as president, has segregated Washington, D.C. Some African Americans tried to come in to eat in the restaurant that was there at the new Supreme Court, and he wouldn't let them in. He went and told Justice Hughes, he said, you know, Black people are trying to come in, but I'll keep them out. He said, come out with me. He says, read what's over the portico of the Supreme Court. And that's the equal justice. And he says, if you can't enforce that, I think you should find a new job. And then it was desegregated. People can make a difference just by following those laws. Do I have time to read the last paragraph? Can I take that
Paul,
time?
do we have time?
Absolutely. Yes,
Can
go
you-
ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Can you put up like the next to the last slide that has Amanda Gorman and Lincoln together? And we'll do that for the share. In the 1951 poem, let's see, is it getting up there?
Yeah, it's coming. You go ahead.
Okay.
You go,
In a
he's pulling up the
1951
PowerPoint.
poem, the Harlem Renaissance bard Langston Hughes asked, what happens to a dream deferred? And that's where the title comes from.
Amanda Gorman and Lincoln
History.
right there.
There you go, yeah.
There you go.
History shaped by the court's unfolding interpretations and limitations on right tells us that justice has been deferred too long. Abraham Lincoln challenged us, determine that the thing can and shall be done, and then we shall find the way. That's the Lincoln quote. We take inspiration from the young people who will be writing the next chapter. In 2019, 2020, the U.S. Youth Poet Laureate Amanda Gorman gave readings around the country of a poem she had been commissioned to write for Independence Day. Now, I want to tell you that I thought I had discovered Amanda Gorman. I did not know that Biden would ask her to read her poem that became so famous on Inauguration Day. So I thought I was introducing someone I had discovered at the time.
Mm-hmm.
In her performance at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Gorman, an African-American woman from Los Angeles who was a student at Harvard, explained that she sees American democracy not as something that's broken, but as something that's unfinished. Rather than falling prey to discouragement, she speaks of being audacious in taking up the mantle of our founders and playing a role in finishing their work. In her poem, Believer's Hymn for the Republic, she declares, every day we write the future together. So I wanted to end on a positive note because the book can be depressing about how the Supreme Court is moving back, but I believe it is these young people. And also Lincoln spoke of his unfinished work in his two greatest speeches. He did elsewhere too, but particularly the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural. So I did a conference called Lincoln's Unfinished Work. And there I did a workshop for school teachers. who were begging for help on how to teach about this difficult problem of race and how we teach about our history of race relations. And I did a workshop, and I think that is part of Lincoln's unfinished work. So that book has just been published, the book I did on Lincoln's unfinished work by LSU Press. And I really think it's up to us to do Lincoln's unfinished work. Each and every one of us, that's what he's calling for, our unfinished work. And that's what Amanda Gorman's doing. I hope that all of us can do what we can to finish that work that was never finished by Lincoln.
Well, on that note, sir, it is a joy as always to just talk with you. And I've been.
And I miss you, Tony. I've really enjoyed our conversations over the years.
Yes, sir. We could be going on for hours, Paul, our producer. And what we hope is that the audience was able to take away some nuggets here, and that you would come into the library, quite frankly, and look at the books, read.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Have the books that basically Paul and the library team has for you to read, especially Justice Deferred, Race in the Supreme Court. Yep, and Dr. Burton's other books are likely there as well. So I just want to thank my friend that basically decided to join so late in South Carolina to do this. It's after 10 o'clock his time. And Paul, thank you.
And thank you
very much.
It's really an honor to be here.
Well,
I had told Paul earlier, I grew up with bookmobiles that came every 2 weeks. And, by the time I was 12, I'd read every book there. And that's where I was introduced to Lincoln. I had two heroes at that time, Lincoln and Jesse James. And the more I read about Jesse James, I realized he was just a mean Confederate that never did anything. The two things for other people. He didn't really rob from the rich and give to the poor. He robbed from everybody, poor and rich. Confederate that never surrendered. But they both loved their mother, and I thought they did things for poor people. And the more I looked at Lincoln, the more I became to admire him, the less I did Jesse James. So it's a real honor to be a part of this. And I so love libraries. I think they are the basis of our knowledge. And if, in fact, some legislatures are successful in stopping teachers, public school teachers, and even in college they're trying, it's those libraries and the knowledge that is there that can save us and save our democracy. So I encourage you. There is on the handout that I sent Paul with the questions thing, there is a link to the web page. It's justice-deferred. And there's a lot on the book. There's a lot more that's in the book. The book was about 4 times that length. There's more than 100 cases that you can see. You can even see where the justices misread the history. And in fact, Judge Roberts, when he got rid of Shelby County, he misread the other case. It said just the opposite of what his argument was. So you can see we have the evidence there. You can judge for yourself who's right, Judge Roberts or Armand and me.
Well, I'm going to say in Fijian Vanaka, which means thank you, which I've learned from the school kids I visited here. So I just want to say thank you both again for the opportunity, Paul.
Thank you, Tony, for making this program possible. It was great. I think this program will give the community lots of things to reflect upon this Juneteenth week. And it's just pitch perfect. And it's an honor to meet you, Professor Burton.
I hope we can do it in person sometime if you ever get to South Carolina.
I love that.
And Tony, I really appreciate you lowering people's expectations with that introduction. So,
well, we're going to try to get you out to California, Paul. Let's work on that, okay?
Absolutely.
Looking forward to it. My wife's brother is out there, and so we're going to try to get out to see him.
Okay,
please give her a hug for me, okay?
I will, Tony. She's in her bed.
Okay.
We really
All right. Well, Thank you again, Tony, Vernon and Tony, and enjoy the rest of your, well, it's evening for you at Vernon, and Tony, it's Fijian vacation day, so enjoy it.
All right.
Thank you for letting us interrupt your vacation, and now you can continue enjoying it. So, and
All right.
thank you, and we'll keep in touch.
Sounds good.
Banaka.
Send me the link.
Banaka.
I'd love to get the link when you do it.
All right.
Have